This expert report got tossed, and it took the whole malpractice case with it down in flames. I recently came across a case when I was searching in Pacer, and I decided to write it up as a case study for my Substack because I think that there's a lot of important takeaways here, both for experts and attorneys. The plaintiff's lawyers, they had put all of their eggs in one basket with a single expert. This can be a little risky depending on the complexity of the case, but this particular expert witness had decades of experience. He's opined on over 200 cases, board certification, 30 years of clinical practice. He's checked all these boxes, so I think we can understand why they went with one. The court, however, completely tossed his opinion, and it left plaintiffs with no experts on the eve of the trial. Why? Well, his report didn't cite a single authoritative source. Not one guideline, not one systematic review, not a single sentence from a textbook. I'm going to talk about what happened and what this case teaches us about expert testimony in the Daubert world that we're living in. But first, to understand how the expert failed and why the court made that decision to toss his report, we need to start with the clinical story, of course, because ultimately the strength of any opinion, it's going to depend on how well it connects to the facts in the case. The patient was a 67-year-old woman with a BMI of 38. She presented to the emergency department on May 7th, 2019. She was complaining of very severe abdominal pain and discomfort. During that visit, she underwent an abdominal ultrasound, and it appeared normal. However, they gave her a non-contrast CT scan, and that revealed irregularities in the liver, including marked nodularity and heterogeneity, abnormal visual patterns in the liver itself. So at that time, the radiologist explicitly recommended follow-up imaging, either an MRI or a contrast-enhanced CT, to better characterize these liver findings. She did not undergo either of those imaging recommendations, and she was discharged from the ED with some pretty standard kind of boilerplate advice, eating better, living better, some over-the-counter medications, and she was set up with an appointment a month later with a gastroenterologist. At that time, this is June 2019 now, she's seen by this gastroenterologist, and he looks over her abnormal CT findings, and again, he acknowledges this recommendation for an MRI or a CT scan, contrast-enhanced CT scan. He instead orders an abdominal sonogram duplex that comes back completely normal, and he just kind of counsels her and sends her on her way. She comes back a month later, says, "Hey doc, these symptoms are not resolved. I'm still experiencing pain and discomfort. Something's not right here." That same gastroenterologist does another sonogram, and this is July now. So that comes back normal. He again kind of counsels her, kind of some boilerplate lifestyle advice, some other things, sends her on her way. 2 months after that visit, we're into September 2019 now, she comes back to that same gastroenterologist. Again, she's like, "I'm really not getting better. My pain and discomfort hasn't resolved. I've been doing everything you've said. Something's not right." He again does another sonogram, and no surprise, that comes back normal. Again, he does acknowledge this original order from the radiologist, and his advice, disregards it. Patient is sent home. At that point, she does not return yet again until October of 2020. So over about 15 months from her initial visit, she goes to the same emergency department she first went to. At that time, She's in pretty severe pain and discomfort, and she complains of unexplained weight loss, quite a lot, about 25 pounds. At that time, they actually did perform a contrast-enhanced CT, and it revealed a liver mass that was larger than 10 centimeters, and unfortunately for her, advanced metastatic disease. She was diagnosed at that time with advanced hepatocellular carcinoma. She was admitted to the hospital. 2 days later, she passed away. So the malpractice claim, it centers around this series of missed opportunities to detect this cancer earlier through more appropriate imaging. The core of the allegation is that the standard of care required acting on that radiologist's recommendation, steps that were never ever taken. Now that we have one foot firmly in the medical world and we have this context, let's put one foot firmly in the legal world, and we're going to review the actual Daubert challenge, and we're going to break that down. So after the court received the expert's report and he was deposed, the defense filed their Daubert motion challenging the admissibility of the plaintiff's expert witness testimony. They argued that his opinion was completely unsupported by scientific evidence and it lacked reliable methodology. Ironically, in their motion, they said this expert is totally qualified to opine on this case. We have no problem with that at all. We have a big problem with his unsupported scientific evidence and lack of reliable methodology. So this document here is the report and recommendation issued by the judge, and I've kind of highlighted some of the judge's specific comments. He says, absent from the expert report and his deposition testimony is a description of the methodology or principles used by him or scientific data on which he relied to determine the standard of care that applied to a gastroenterologist's treatment of the patient. The judge goes on to say, the expert failed to cite any medical data, publications, literature, protocols, professional standards, or even to the generalized practice of gastroenterology to justify his conclusion as to the applicable standards of care. As such, we have absolutely no information regarding the principles or methodology used by the expert to conclude that the standards of care given to the patient and this part right here, the judge is specifically pointing out a major issue that he had with the expert during his deposition. In response to questions from counsel as to whether the abdominal sonogram duplex ordered by the defendant could have replaced the CT with contrast or MRI findings, the expert testified that he would need to conduct further research on that topic to be able to discuss this. Quote, the expert said, as to whether or not obtaining a duplex ultrasound would have supplemented or replaced the CT or MRI findings, I would need to do, well, if I'm going to be asked that question at a trial, I would reserve the right to research that topic because this is not a topic I was prepared to discuss. Okay. Probably should have had some research done and gone into the deposition prepared. The judge further reprimands him and says implicit in this deposition testimony is that the expert had not yet even completed the research to establish whether the national standard of medical care applicable to the patient at the time she was treated required following the recommendation of the radiologist. And finally, the judge just says, for the reasons I've discussed, my conclusion is that the expert opinions included in his report and deposition would not assist the jury in identifying and understanding the national standard of care of any deviation by the defendant from the standard of care. So the expert, in response to this motion being granted and ruling that, you know, your opinion is not enough. You need to come and with science and evidence and data. The expert responded with this affidavit. And again, this is his methodology. He just says, hey, my methodology is that I've been doing this a long time. I'm educated. I've got a great background. I'm up to date on my CME, and trust me, you gotta trust me. Then he drops in these 3 articles, and I'm going to break them down and kind of further critique these. So this first article that he cites is actually the strongest of the 3, and I would consider it not that great. So the pros of it are that it provides really strong evidence that obesity impairs the quality of abdominal ultrasound, and high-performance probes improve accuracy. This is directly relevant, of course, because our patient had a BMI of 38. So it's also peer-reviewed. It's fairly recent source. It shows attention to modern diagnostic limitations in obese populations. It also supports this idea that ultrasound may not have been the best imaging choice for this patient if it had been used in lieu of a CT or MRI. And it also visually had some nice images that I think could have helped a jury if they had been able to see these. And it just, shows that the difficulties, the visual impairment of using an ultrasound to, show any type of detail of a lesion and do a proper diagnosis. The cons of this source, the expert threw in here, is that it's technical and it's very narrowly focused on probe performance. It doesn't comment on the imaging selection or diagnostic standards. It's published in a scientific report. So yeah, okay, it's peer reviewed. It's sometimes viewed as more generalist and less clinically authoritative. It's also European. So, you could argue, it might be a stretch, but that it's not reflective of US standards or guidelines. And also kind of the weird choice he made is he just drops a couple quotes in here from this article. Hey, here's the citation. Here are these quotes. And no context, no method, no explanation. He's not linking it to the patient. And I'll expand on that a little bit later. His next article is from the Cleveland Clinic Journal of Medicine, and it's entitled, When is Contrast Needed for Abdominal and Pelvic CT? So the pros of this source are it clearly lists liver cancer and abnormal liver findings as indications for contrast-enhanced CT, reinforcing that the original radiologist's recommendation for follow-up images with contrast, it aligns with accepted clinical practice. Another pro is that it's published in a respected U.S. clinical journal, which could be viewed as authoritative in a courtroom. It's also practical and it's clinically applicable. It could be useful to anchor a standard of care argument, but I would not lead with this. And if this is kind of the strongest you have, it's not a real strong base, I would say. The third article is a StatPearl article entitled Living Imaging. And so the pros of this are that it offers a broad clinical overview of imaging modalities for liver lesions and hepatocellular carcinoma. It may help justify why MRI or contrast CT would be standard modalities for follow-up of abnormal liver findings. And StatPearl it's regularly updated and it's vetted by clinicians. So those are the pros. The cons, it's an online reference resource. It's not a peer-reviewed article, so it is informative, but it could be seen as less rigorous and low, not authoritative in court. It doesn't provide case-specific guidance. It's got to be paired with more tailored literature, guidelines to establish a solid standard of care claim. Also, this is a tertiary source. It's basically a teaching summary. It's not a peer-reviewed journal article. Methodologically, I would say it's not rigorous. So it could be disqualified in court as inadmissible or weak evidence. Now, and then he, again, the last kind of closing comment he just says here is, using the methodology described above, I can state that a reasonable emergency medicine physician or gastroenterologist would have recognized on May 7th that the patient was an obese woman and abnormalities seen on non-contrast CT of the abdomen was not visible on the ultrasound. And so, that's what he closes with. So the main problem and weaknesses of both his report, deposition, and then this supplemental affidavit is that there's no clear linkage between the literature and the expert's conclusion about the standard of care. Basically, the expert, he didn't connect the dots. He dropped a few studies in there, but he never clearly said, hey, here's what this study shows, and here's how that proves the doctor violated the standard of care in this exact case. It's like quoting a medical article without explaining why it matters, which is exactly what he did. He just kind of dropped these quotes in there. He didn't say why this applies to the patient, the test that was missed, or the timing of the care. The court didn't just want a list of sources. They wanted a step-by-step explanation of how those sources backed up the expert's opinion. Kind of the second main problem here is there's no discussion of the methodology. The expert stated he relied on his training and experience, but he didn't explain how that experience informed a reliable, testable conclusion. The expert never explained how he reached his opinion, and he didn't walk the court through the steps he took, the guidelines he followed, or the process he used to evaluate what the doctor should have done. He just gave his conclusion without showing the work behind it. So, for example, he didn't describe whether he used an analytical framework or applied decision-making algorithms or compared the treating physician's actions against published clinical pathways. He didn't say, hey, here's the pathway most providers follow when a liver lesion shows up on a non-contrast CT in a patient with elevated BMI, and here's where the pathway was broken. Another kind of weakness was the sources that he cited, they're not definitive. They offered kind of general support, kind of vague support, but not strong enough foundation to establish a binding or nationally recognized standard. The judge's response was, quote, essentially the affidavit's attempt to substantiate the expert's opinion regarding the applicable standards of care after the close of discovery and after the R&R was issued and a month before the trial was scheduled. So basically what the judge is saying is experts have to include this information from the beginning. The motion to bar testimony stage is too late. So in this instance, by then the damage was done. I would have thought that an experienced med mal firm would have noticed that the expert's report had no meat in that sandwich, and they would have pushed for a stronger report, or they would have got an altogether new expert. I was kind of curious and I looked up the law firm, and I did confirm that they had handled a few other med mal cases, but I could only find a few. Their kind of vibe was that they were more like a slip and fall type personal injury shop. And so that could be a possible explanation of why they didn't push for a stronger report from the expert. So, what sources could have helped the expert in this case? I think there were actually a handful of guidelines that could have done the trick. One of them is from the American College of Radiology, and it is the appropriateness criteria, particularly the variant 2 chart. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, that's the standard that was never followed, basically. And what it is it outlines the recommended imaging follow-up for an indeterminate liver lesion greater than 2 centimeters found on a non-contrast CT in a patient without known liver disease. So that clinical scenario fits our patient. Both MRI with contrast and contrast enhanced CT are rated as usually appropriate, whereas CT non-contrast and the sonograms that they kept doing over and over again are rated as not appropriate. So despite these clear guidances, no follow-up imaging ever took place, and that diagnostic pathway basically stopped there. And unfortunately with it, the patient's chance at an early detection. I think also the LIRADS guidelines could have come in handy, and those are the liver imaging reporting and data system. They're used nationally for risk stratification of liver masses, especially in patients at risk for hepatocellular carcinoma. And it was created to standardize how radiologists evaluate and report liver lesions. And it covers surveillance, diagnosis, staging, treatment, that sort of thing. And these are systems that are national guidelines, and they're relied on when defining the standards of care. So I think that could have been helpful. I also don't think it would have been too much of a stretch to grab some guidelines pertaining to communication standards, particularly those put out by the Joint Commission. They have some sentinel events, Alert 54 and 58, and they identify failures to act on abnormal test results as major contributors to preventable harm. Also, structured handoff tools like SBAR could have helped ensure critical recommendations like the radiologist's call for an MRI, that they don't fall through the cracks. I also found some systematic reviews that could have further laid a good base. Two of them both found that MRI to be superior for evaluating indeterminate liver lesions. And I found another one that emphasizes that MRI with contrast is the gold standard for early HCC detection. There also was another systematic review that I found that showed that ultrasound imaging quality deteriorates severely, and it flags it as a severe warning when the patient has a BMI over 30. In this case, our patient had a BMI of 38. So that's a critical contextual factor that should have been discussed. I think if the expert would have explained how these sources were applied to the specific facts of the case, rather than just saying, well, the care was substandard, it would have been very helpful. And, because remember, the expert has to show how the literature informs his conclusion. Also, they needed to demonstrate clear methodology, whether it's differential diagnosis framework or an algorithmic approach or an expert consensus that others in the field would recognize as valid. So I think that the sources I just reviewed, when applied properly, could have been incredibly helpful. Remember, the law doesn't expect perfection, but it does expect preparation. And the courtroom credibility doesn't come from just credentials alone. It comes from connecting clinical reasoning to evidence clearly and methodically. Without strong literature, even the right opinion can be excluded. Without methodology, even a seasoned expert can be disqualified. And in this case, it torpedoed the entire case before it even got to jury. I think this is a good case study because it's a cautionary tale, both for experts and attorneys alike, and for anyone whose case depends on testimony. that can survive a Daubert challenge. Don't wait until the challenge hits. Build it right the first time. Cite the guidelines, show your methods, ground the opinion in published peer-reviewed court-admissible evidence, because in today's courtroom, close enough, it's just not enough. And even the right opinion without the right foundation won't make it to trial. I hope you found this case study enlightening and interesting, and I hope to see you in future videos. Please hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll put out more content in the very near future.